South Sudan is yet to fully implement the 2018 peace agreement, a fact that has the European Union worried. The EU has since warned that it will consider sanctioning individuals who attempt to undermine the deal. EU Commissioner for Crisis Management Yanis Lenarchuk today met President Salva Kiir and the first Vice President Riek Machar in the capital Juba to discuss the matter. He urged them to accelerate the implementation of the agreement in order to end violence and avert the famine-like conditions. The EU previously adopted the sanctions the United Nations Security Council introduced against several individuals who it said undermined the peace process in South Sudan. The EU also introduced additional sanctions of its own. Lenarchuk says the implementation of a peace deal will end violence and facilitate provision of humanitarian aid. The country at the moment is facing the food crisis, and the EU says the situation is very critical and needs urgent attention. Now, for more on this, we are now joined by Dr Jok Madut Jok to talk to us more about the significance of the EU warning. Dr Jok, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you and to your listeners. Very happy to be here.
Well, it's such a pleasure having you join us again, Dr. Jok, to share more on the developments coming out of Sudan. I mean, when the peace agreement was made back in 2018, there was so much hope that violence would finally come to an end in South Sudan. But none of that still has come to fruition. What is stopping the implementation of this peace agreement?
The peace agreement, like many others, signed across the African continent, has one project and one project only in the minds of those people who sign it. And that project is power sharing and distribution of resources between the warring parties who agree to form a government and merge into their offices in the African capitals. What is not included in those agreements often is what are the best ways to translate what is essentially an elite pact into real peace, into tangible dividends that can touch the lives of everyday people. This is exactly what has happened with the peace agreement in South Sudan, between the government under Salva Kiir Mayardit and various opposition groups, including the first Vice President, Dr. Riek Machar, who was also the head of the principal opposition armed group. Now, when they signed the agreement in 2018, the agreement has various clauses in it. The most important, in my view, is Chapter 2 of that agreement, which is focused on security arrangement and security reforms, including cantonment of their fighting forces with an eye to eventually creating a national army, a national defense forces made up of all these groups. This process has stalled, and the government says that it's due to money. The rest of South Sudanese say that this is not the case. What is stalling the peace agreement is that these gentlemen and ladies who have signed this peace agreement are milking the agreement for as long as they can by staying in office forever and not be pushed to the eventual conclusion, which is to conduct a census and conduct elections after the interim period. So what is holding this peace agreement from being implemented really is the way that it was signed. It wasn't signed with an eye to saving the lives and improving conditions of the ordinary citizens. It was signed to keep these gentlemen and women and ladies in office. And that's exactly what is going on. They march to their posh offices while the rest of the population rots in misery.
Well, it does appear that the ruling elites are now turning against each other, and this has cast a cloud of doubt on the effectiveness of this 2018 peace agreement. Do you get a sense then that it is a sort of a long-term fix, a long-term plan that will fix South Sudan's problems?
It doesn't seem that the way the peace agreement has been negotiated and concluded lends itself to being a long-term solution. Not at all. But With that said, I think in the absence of any better alternatives, many South Sudanese say, okay, it's a bad agreement, but it's better to have it than have none. So let's see how it can be best managed to steer the country away from everyday violence to a place of order and plans for a better future. And that is where South Sudanese are still holding their breath for their political leaders and military leaders to do right by them and say and implement what they said they were going to do in the agreement. What we are seeing so far is that yes, the various political parties have agreed to do something, but they are not doing it because a state of no war and no peace, which we have currently, is good for them. Some of these political leaders thrive in chaos. They don't want order to come to South Sudan because order means that some of them will lose office, and losing office means losing resources. So it's a dire picture I am painting, no question about it. But the situation is actually far worse than what I'm saying. And I'm afraid there is no clear roadmap to South Sudan to move out of that morass, other than perhaps the citizens themselves coming to a conclusion in the end that the peace agreement is not going to lead to any kind of transition. And the only thing that might push these leaders to speed up the process of holding elections is mass protest. South Sudan does not have a long history of civil society and activist groups that can stage a gigantic protest such as what we saw in 2019 Sudan. But it seems like that is the only way South Sudan is going to have to go if there is going to be any dream of this situation changing from the state of a stalemate to a state where something is moving.
As the country is already on a transitional period that will lead to elections, you just mentioned that there is absolutely no clear roadmap that will leave the country out of the current morass that it finds itself in. I want us to discuss in greater detail the election model, whether the current winner-takes-all model, wherein one party takes power and the other party loses power. Will that help the situation of South Sudan towards leading the country out of the political crisis that it finds itself in?
I think you've just put your finger on the pulse, really, in the sense that even as many South Sudanese think that the transition should happen through elections, I think a lot of people are also worried that such an election will either lead to one ruling party, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, fighting and shooting and rigging its way into office by majority vote, but by doing so, forcing all the other contenders to have no choice but to go back to war. So there is a serious likelihood that elections in 2023, if they happen, might be another start of the next round of conflict between those who win elections by trickery and those who lose by their vote being stolen. And so there is really a very dire situation we are looking at when it comes to South Sudan. Either the South Sudanese themselves take the issues into their own hands and march onto the streets of the cities and demand that the government being given back to them so that they can new people can be brought forth as they did in Sudan. Or you have two situations to choose from. You continue with the current leadership that is dragging its feet on the implementation of the peace agreement into the eternity, or they will say, let's hold elections, but these elections can also trigger a new round of conflict. And so South Sudan is really in a situation where it's damned if it holds elections, it damned it doesn't.
What do you suggest the country does then? Because we know that South Sudan is dotted with so many ethnic groups, scattered in different parts of the country. Should the country govern having incorporated all these ethnic groups in its governance, or should only those groups which have performed well in elections, take over?
Well, if there were elections and they were peaceful and everybody accepted losing, there will be no need for us to talk about tribes and ethnic groups, because what will happen would be political parties duking it out, and political parties are not tribal based. So that would be the best scenario, that the political leaders, as they are today, in whether they are in the government or in opposition, to say, let us just hold elections, and if you lose, you wait for the next round. My fear is that there are so many military and political leaders in South Sudan who are vying for the top job, and they will not take anything other than winning. So if they lose, they will want to impose themselves by force, or start another round of war. And so the solution, in my view, it's not a viable one, but it's a dream of, I would say, of so many people in South Sudan, and that is for the current leadership in office, opposition and government, who have formed this coalition government called the Transitional Government of National Unity, for them to say, the current leadership, the president and the various vice presidents, so South Sudan has 5 vice presidents, that they steer the country towards elections and then step down and not run for office. In that way, South Sudan will have a clean slate. But that will take an act of nationalism and patriotism on the part of the current leadership, saying that the country has gone down the drain under our watch. If this country is to take a clean start on a clean slate, the current top leadership must not run for office in the next round, because that is a sure way to return the country back to chaos.
So in short, you are insinuating that a broader power sharing deal and a political settlement that sort of decentralizes the government cannot be a solution for the mess that the country is in?
Absolutely not. I mean, power sharing and resource sharing model as a way of making peace in a neoliberal sense, that means in a sense that everybody must come to the table and everybody must be given a piece of the pie, is not a viable way of doing peace. The idea is everyone will want a cut of the cake, and the cake is only so big; it can go to only so many people. So if the idea is that you either get a share or you go to war, then what has South Sudan got?
But is there not a danger, though, that those who lost may want to return to war?
That is the danger. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Those who lose elections, especially if you pay attention to how they lose, like the votes being rigged, the state apparatus being used by the ruling party to muscle its way out into power again, the way we have seen all over the place in Africa. We saw that in Chad a couple of weeks ago, and you have seen what has happened in Chad as a result. We saw that in Uganda not long ago. We see that in all these places were ruled by people who have been in power 20, 30 years. And the result is that either they keep the power and the situation remains miserable, that's the way it has always been, or those who lose power go to war. It may not be the case everywhere that people go to war when they lose, but South Sudan is such a fragile place with such deep divisions along political and ethnic lines that those who lose and seeing that they lost by trickery will have no choice but to want to shoot their way back into power.
What about a constitutional review process? Can it resolve most of the country's problems?
Well, that was one of the clauses in the peace agreement, the so-called revitalized peace agreement. One of the clauses was for the constitution to be reviewed. The transitional constitution of South Sudan, 2011, is the constitution running the country today, but they say it should be reviewed in view of the new agreement so that the articles of the agreement can be incorporated. And it calls for a variety of reforms and changes, including total overhaul of the Legislative Assembly, of the Council of State, overhaul of the way civil service is hired, reform the military. The constitution was supposed to be reviewed and incorporated before the next elections, because how do you hold elections now without a new constitution? But seeing that it has delayed, it means that even the timeline for the elections is not on track, and it will not happen. And if it doesn't happen as the peace agreement has called for, what will the rest of South Sudanese have as a fallback position, as a way to challenge the leaders? If the constitution is not there, they will only say that these people who have signed this peace agreement and wrote themselves into public offices are simply dragging their feet as a way for them to stay in office, because they don't stand a chance if they actually do a genuine constitution and genuine elections, because the people will have become so fed up with them that they will not be voted into office again.
Now, the European Union has joined in the fray and threatening to impose sanctions on those who seek to undermine the deal. Would such threats help, though? Because we've seen in some other African countries, some leaders have been undeterred by the threats and, the threats and the imposition of certain sanctions on them, and they pushed on with their policies, which perhaps the Western countries did not like. So would an imposition of sanctions help in the situation?
No, sanctions won't help. Sanctions never help. As someone, myself, having looked at, the U.S. sanctions on Iran, on Iraq, the sanctions on Sudan, and all these sanctions that have come over the years and have not led to any alteration in the behavior of those being sanctioned. On the contrary, these sanctions have been extremely detrimental to the countries, because you might call them smart sanctions, meaning they were a scalpel, meaning surgically sanctioning individuals rather than a hammer sanctioning the entire country. But what we have noticed is that even the so-called smart sanctions often don't work, because they simply tarnish the image of that entire country, so that economic institutions and banking institutions simply just cut business with that country. And the result is that that country will not function economically on a global stage. So they affect the country in the end and not the people that were targeted for sanctioning. I think these sanctions don't work. They absolutely don't work. And evidence is out there showing that the so-called smart sanctions are actually stupid sanctions. And those ones proposed by the European Union are not any exception.
Well, one can be forgiven that, by opining that the interest of the European Union on South Sudan should be taken with a pinch of salt. I mean, the kind of interest that the European Union, the Western nations have on African countries because of the large, mineral resources can never be understated. I mean, it's always been documented in the past. So do you think the European Union has some sort of peculiar interest in South Sudan for having leveraged so much attention on this country?
There is no question that these sanctions that have been imposed on African countries and other developing countries have been singularly Western sanctions, right? It's not one African country sanctioning another African country. It's Europeans and North Americans always imposing sanctions on African countries. And so there is something that is peculiar and curious about these sanctions, whether they are linked to a situation where a lot of times they are linked to human rights, right? If this leadership of these countries are abusing the rights of their people, it is incumbent upon governments around the world to impose sanctions on these people and expect them to behave better. The gist of the matter is that it's not always just about human rights. It's not about the famine situation, as you said in your introduction. It's not about the oppression of opposition or killing of people. It is mainly about what the capitalist developed global northern countries want the African countries to do in order for them to be invited into the conference of nations. France, for example, was very keen on keeping Idriss Deby in Chad. And France is mourning the deaths of Deby today more than the Chadians themselves. The Chadians are saying the resources of Chad have been at the disposal of France and not to the people of Chad themselves. Therefore, it's France and Macron crying over the deaths of Deby and not the Chadian people. It's the same thing everywhere where there is bad governance, where there is dictatorship, where there is a lot of resources to be harvested, that the Europeans and North Americans always find themselves imposing sanctions on the governments of that place, not because the people want the sanctions. All the people want is if there is going to be any help from outside, help these people in these countries to challenge their governments on a democratic platform, but not to impose sanctions and destroy the economies of these countries, making their resources available for peanuts on a global stage.
Yeah, you've made quite a very valid point there, and quite significant, I must say, when you made that example of France, mourning the death of former President Idriss Deby, even more than the Chadians themselves. I mean, it shows the extent of the level of the interest some of these Western and European countries have on Africa, whether that kind of interest is genuine and is at the best interest of the African citizens themselves. Now, the African Union, or rather the United Nations peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, what's your impression of its role in terms of stabilizing the country and bringing about peace?
Well, the United Nations peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, has really depended on the caliber of who is at the helm of it. In the past, there have been Europeans who ran it, and it flopped. There was an Australian, David Shearer, who was just the outgoing head of UNMISS, and now he's going to be replaced by your own compatriot from South Africa. And so we feel that under David Shearer, UNMISS has actually been a lot more cooperative with the local government, with the government of the host country, which is usually what you should do, because you can't come in, be hosted by a government of a particular country and then be hostile to that government, to your own host. And I think the role of UNMISS has been, the South Sudanese have been very hospitable to UNMISS on one account and only one account, and that is to help them build their institutions, especially the policing, the military units, and judiciary and human rights. And UNMISS has done admirably well in that regard. The problem is peacekeeping missions are not a solution to a peace that doesn't exist in the first place. In order to be a genuine peacekeeping, the South Sudanese need to be committed to their own peace themselves. And that the only thing that the United Nations can do is to ensure that that the clause of the agreements and the hostility, the agreements on cessation of hostilities and reining in on the armed groups that they are done. But it is not the responsibility of the UN to ensure the safety and welfare and the security of the citizens. It's a fundamental responsibility of the host state. And if the state is failing to do the basics, there is really very little the UN can do. And the whole, the UN has been in so many different places. In Congo, going since 1965, what has the UN done to ensure the safety of the Congolese people? Congo, under the UN watch, still became the world's capital of rape. So why should UNMISS, the little one in South Sudan, be considered the safety net for the people of South Sudan while the state is failing miserably?
You know, Dr. Jok, I'm made to understand that insufficient funding, is sort of further complicating efforts of bringing about peace in South Sudan. So is that a genuine excuse for stalling the peace process or the implementation of the peace agreement? Or is it, a ploy by certain sinister motives and sinister forces within the country's government to undermine the implementation of this peace agreement?
It may well be related to it, but I don't think the government of South Sudan yes, the country is broke essentially in macroeconomics and microeconomics, but the government has no lack of money. Let's say, for example, when the first thing that the peace agreement had called for was for the government to come up with $60 million to canton all the various armed groups that were fighting and who have now become part of the governing coalition. $60 million to put all the fighting forces in camps for training with an eye to eventually forming a national army from that. The government said they didn't have $60 million. Within a month of saying that they didn't have money, the president, Salva Kiir Mayardit, declared that he was going to go on a road trip from Juba to Wau, towards his hometown, a region called Bahr Ghazal. In order to do that, they ordered 1,000 top-of-the-line SUV vehicles from Japan, each one of them going for $100,000, far surpassing what the country needed in order to canton the soldiers. So it's not about money in the end. I think it is largely about how that money is used and the corruption and mismanagement that goes into it.
All right. And
it is largely a ploy to stall the progress of the peace agreement. And it comes, that is stalling of the peace agreement comes at the detriment of the welfare and livelihoods of the people of South Sudan. While the leaders are in their offices, living in nice places, the rest of the country is living in misery.